They told me I was lucky, marrying into the Prescott family, sipping champagne beneath chandeliers, living in a house with a name instead of an address. But no one saw the way my mother-in-law's smile twitched when I voiced an opinion. No one heard the silence at the dinner table when I spoke of going back to work. The locks changed on a Tuesday. No warning. Just my suitcase on the porch and a note that said, "Thank you for your service." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I rebuilt, quietly. And now, they pay rent to the woman they threw away. The first time Margaret Prescott touched my cheek, she called me a porcelain treasure. Her fingers were cold, her smile carefully measured. I had just said my vows in a chapel drenched in white lilies, and she whispered, "You'll shine here, Rachel." But no, shining too bright can be blinding. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. They dressed me in silk and praise. Daniel's sisters introduced me at every charity brunch as the heart of the family. I was seated next to Margaret at dinners, asked about flower arrangements, and invited to weigh in on party themes. But only that. My background in finance? Too sharp for family matters, Margaret once joked. Everyone laughed, including me. Daniel was sweet. When he wasn't deferring to his mother, he used to call me brilliant before we married. Afterwards, it became, "My Rachel knows how to keep a home." I remember smiling when he said it at a foundation gala, surrounded by patrons who once requested my advice on market timing. I smiled because that's what porcelain does. It cracks on the inside but stays polished for display. Margaret would send me books, antique volumes on etiquette, cooking, child rearing, never once anything on leadership or strategy. When I brought up returning to work, she tilted her head and said, "Why disrupt what's already perfect?" So I stayed. I polished the silver, I learned to host the way her mother had. I stood behind Daniel at functions like a shadow in designer heels. I swallowed every dismissal like it was an hors d'oeuvre. The night of the fall equinox ball, I wore a champagne-colored gown she chose for me. Subtle elegance, she called it. Catherine, Daniel's older sister, arrived in a crimson sheath dress that caught every eye in the room. I was halfway through greeting guests when I overheard Catherine talking to a board member near the wine table. "Rachel." "No, she won't inherit. The estate's been secured under the Prescott Trust. Mother saw to it before the wedding." I froze. The string quartet played on. I forced my feet to move, to smile, to laugh when necessary. My heart pounded in my ears louder than the cello. Later that night, in the powder room, I stayed behind while others filed out. Through the cracked door, I heard Margaret's voice, sharp, low, and unmistakably cold. I warned Daniel. Love is sweet, but money is blood. We protect legacy, not sentiment. That's why I had the clause added. Rachel will be looked after, but she won't own us. That was the first time I cried in that house, not from loss, but from clarity. The next morning, Daniel was out early. Margaret sat at the breakfast table, sipping her tea. I asked her gently if she knew about the trust clause. She smiled. "Darling, this house isn't just bricks and mortar. It's tradition. And tradition requires structure. You're part of this family in every way that matters." I asked if Daniel knew. "He trusts me," she replied, stirring her tea with perfect grace. "As should you." I stared at her, this woman who once called me a treasure, realizing now I was never more than decor. Something displayed, never meant to own, never meant to belong. That evening, Daniel came home late. I asked him directly. He deflected, said Margaret handled all that estate stuff, said he didn't want to get into dry legal talk. I watched his eyes. He knew, and he chose not to tell me. That night, I packed a small suitcase, not because I had a plan, but because I needed space to breathe. I left to buy cold medicine from the pharmacy. When I returned, the locks had changed. My name wasn't on the deed. Margaret made sure of that. My suitcase sat on the porch. A handwritten note was taped to the door. "Time apart will be good for both sides." I didn't knock. I didn't scream. I sat on the curb with my suitcase and my silence, watching the lights flicker behind the stained glass windows. They thought they'd erased me, but I was done being porcelain. I disappeared on a Wednesday. No grand exit, no divorce papers on headlines, no sobbing farewell. Just a single ride share out of Westbridge Hills and a hotel room 2 cities over with cracked wallpaper and the faint smell of bleach. My name was still Rachel Whitmore, but the world wouldn't hear from her again for a while. In the lobby, I signed the check-in form with a name I hadn't used in years, Ray Monroe, a name from my graduate thesis days when I wrote financial papers no one believed a woman authored. Ray Monroe sounded like someone no one could underestimate. I was going to become her again. No, I was going to become more. The room was small. 2 lamps, 1 window, and a mattress that bowed in the middle. I laid my suitcase down, pulled out my laptop, and logged into an old client platform I hadn't touched in 5 years. Passwords still worked. Muscle memory, just like the spreadsheets, just like the math, just like the instinct. Within 2 days, I had 6 emails asking if I was accepting clients. I posted a single anonymous thought piece on a major wealth blog dissecting the collapse of a high-profile hedge fund. The piece went viral, not because of scandal, but because of clarity. Someone wrote in the comments, "Only a woman who's been burned could write this." They were right. I didn't attach my real name. I didn't need to. What I needed was control. I took freelance contracts under Ray. I reopened a shell LLC I had created back in my 20s and turned it into a consulting firm, Ember Point. Quiet, clean, untraceable. I still woke up sometimes hearing Margaret's voice. "You're part of this family in every way that matters." What she meant was, I mattered only when I obeyed. I played those words in my head like a cold meditation until they became firewood. One night, I sat on the floor of my room, laptop propped against my knees, surrounded by Post-it notes, red wine, and unopened bills. I drafted something that wasn't just a plan, it was a system, a philosophy. I called it the Phoenix Protocol. It wasn't a revenge list, it was an equation. Asset structures, legal blind spots, media timing, brand psychology, wealth asymmetry. A playbook that would allow someone like me, displaced, discredited, disinherited, to not only return to the game but redefine it. I researched every asset the Prescott family owned: foundations, offshore holdings, trust arrangements, and real estate shells. Some were public, others buried under decades of vanity. But vanity, as it turns out, leaves fingerprints. Through dummy accounts and neutral brokers, I began acquiring micro-holdings in firms connected to their portfolio. A PR agency here, a logistics company there. I didn't need to be in the spotlight. I just needed to own the stage. At the end of each day, I hand-wrote a mantra on the back of a receipt or napkin or hotel notepad. They taught me silence. I will teach them consequence. My fingers trembled the first time I emailed a contact at one of Margaret's former donors, pretending to be Ray Monroe from Ember Point. I pitched a restructuring strategy that, if implemented, would redirect several zeros away from Prescott-linked charities. The donor replied within hours, "Where have you been hiding?" I smiled. I wasn't hiding. I was emerging. I started wearing black turtlenecks again. Something about them felt sharp, unapologetic. The Rachel they had erased wore pastels and pearls. Ray Monroe drank espresso, not chamomile. She didn't wait to be invited to speak. By week 6, I had enough capital to secure my first large stake, a luxury property brokerage that once partnered with Daniel's firm. The irony made it taste sweeter than any wine Margaret ever poured. I didn't post anything on social media. I let whispers do the talking, and they talked. I watched the Prescott name slowly lose luster in niche financial circles. A few awkward interviews. A small audit. A delay in donor payments. Nothing massive, but enough to plant a question. Were they still untouchable? I wasn't looking for headlines. I was building momentum because I knew empires don't fall from earthquakes. They crumble from termites. I never raised my voice. That was the rule. Let them forget how I sounded. Let them only remember the void I left, until that silence came back to haunt them in boardrooms and investor calls. By the end of month 2, Ember Point had become the quiet fire behind 3 regional acquisitions. Nothing flashy, no press releases. Just signatures, contracts, and shifting loyalties. Every transaction was routed through holding companies in names that meant nothing to anyone but me. My initials scrambled. My mother's maiden name, the zip code of the hotel where the locks changed. I didn't need the world to see Ray Monroe. I only needed the Prescotts to feel her breath on their necks. I declined every podcast invite, every panel appearance. When asked for a headshot by a partner firm, I replied with, "Ember Point prefers to speak through performance." It became my tagline, mysterious, efficient, and very un-Prescott. The first target was a forgotten commercial strip Daniel's firm held in its portfolio, a mixed-use block in a fading part of town. No one bid during the initial offering. I did through a tech front based in Portland, a quiet deal. Daniel never looked up from the contract, I'm sure. Next came the water rights on a Prescott-owned vineyard. Margaret loved that vineyard. She once told me it tasted like legacy. I bought the adjacent supplier's warehouse, then the transportation contracts. I never needed to touch the vineyard, I just needed to squeeze the arteries around it. Deals like that don't make headlines. They just tighten slowly, like silk ribbons around a throat. By the third quarter, I controlled small but strategic slices of nearly every Prescott adjacent interest. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to change margins, to alter timelines, to frustrate outcomes. And then came the whisper. It began, appropriately, at a dinner party. A former Prescott donor was overheard in a Westbridge cigar bar saying, "Word is there's a woman, used to be close to the family, now circling them like a shark. A polite shark, but still." Margaret heard it through her bridge partner, who heard it from her lawyer's wife, who heard it from a stylist. And suddenly, the walls began to shift. Catherine texted Daniel, "Have you seen this? Is it her?" Daniel didn't reply, not because he didn't suspect, but because he did. Margaret summoned the family attorney. He assured her everything was secure. Legal, locked, ironclad, but even iron rusts. I didn't touch their name. I touched everything else. The moment I saw the lot adjacent to their estate listed quietly on a redevelopment platform, I moved. The parcel was small, just a forgotten greenhouse and a driveway with shared access rights. Useless to most. But to me, it was a fault line. I acquired it through a shell called Fay Holdings, short for Phoenix, if you rearrange the letters. The documents passed without question. After all, who would contest a mid-tier holding firm from Kansas? Margaret noticed the construction crews first, trucks, fencing, survey markers. She called the city. They confirmed permits were in place. She called Daniel. He said he'd look into it. What neither of them knew was this. I wasn't just buying land. I was buying the air around them. I announced a new boutique, co-working and innovation hub for female entrepreneurs on the site. Sustainable architecture, women-led leadership, luxury partnerships. The press release was elegant, and nowhere did it mention Ember Point or Ray Monroe. But a few sharp eyes noticed the language, the tone, the phrasing. "She writes like that woman who published the hedge fund essay," one consultant noted. "You know, the ghost." And the ghost smiled. Margaret hosted a dinner to reassert her place. Dozens of guests, fine wine, the usual performance. But the buzz wasn't about her chandelier or her duck à l'orange. It was about the new project next door. "Imagine being boxed in by your past," one guest murmured, "and she's doing it so gracefully." The whisper became a hum. Not loud, but constant. I didn't need to confront them. I let the air shift. Let the temperature rise. Let them sweat under chandeliers they no longer owned alone. The takeover didn't arrive with a bang. It came in silence, in language buried on page 42 of a quarterly financial report, in the fine print below a section titled Special Asset Consolidations. No headlines, no press conference, just a list of newly acquired entities under Fay Holdings, including the deed to 714 Marigold Lane, also known as the Prescott Estate. The final signatures were digital, efficient, cold. I sat in a cafe across from a courthouse in Charleston when the last file uploaded. It took 6 seconds for the ownership ledger to update. After nearly a year, I now controlled every inch of the home they had built their legacy upon. I didn't cry. I did, however, close my laptop, sip my coffee, and write 3 letters. They were handwritten, no return address. Cream-colored stationery. My script was steady, practiced, almost elegant, the kind of handwriting Margaret once praised before she rewrote my future behind closed doors. The letter to Daniel was the shortest. You were silence when I needed a voice. I'll return the favor. Catherine's was longer. She once pretended to be my sister. Funny, isn't it? You spent so long guarding what wasn't yours, only to watch it change hands without your name ever being mentioned. Margaret's letter was simple. 5 lines. There's no more room for the past. Not on this land. Not in these walls. Not in my name. I am the present. I paid for express delivery. They would all receive their letters the same day the staff at Marigold Lane were notified of new ownership. No one was let go. No drama. Just a restructuring memo with the Fay Holdings seal and instructions to await further communication. The estate wasn't empty. They still lived there, technically, but only because I allowed it. By acquiring the mortgage and surrounding properties, I had created a financial maze that gave me full leverage over the land, the utilities, even the water line. Their title was ceremonial now. The real power had shifted. I knew when Margaret read the letter, she didn't call. She sent an email to the Prescott Foundation's board announcing her intent to step back for health reasons. Catherine didn't respond. Daniel sent a 1-line text. Why? I didn't reply. Some questions deserved to echo. Instead, I arrived at the estate the next morning, not to gloat, not to punish. I walked the perimeter alone. The early fog kissed the hedges. I passed the rose garden I once pruned under Margaret's gaze, the patio where Daniel first kissed me, the guest house where I slept the night before they locked me out. I reached the front steps and stood still. The door remained shut. I didn't need to go in. I didn't want their house. I wanted what it represented, the illusion that they could define me, erase me, cage me. I had taken that from them. By noon, the story had begun to ripple, not through tabloids, but through whispers in financial circles. A woman had silently acquired the Prescott stronghold. A phantom had turned the table without raising her voice. They started calling me the Phoenix in closed-door meetings. A consultant at Eastbridge mentioned it on a call. She's not after headlines, she's after legacy. I liked that. That afternoon, I held a private luncheon at the new Ember Point campus, not far from Marigold Lane. 40 women attended, all leaders, all underestimated at some point. I told them my story, not with names, but with truth, not with vengeance, but with clarity. You don't have to set fire to the past, I said. You just have to stop building your future with its ashes. They applauded. Some cried. One whispered, "You're the woman they said disappeared." I smiled. I did, and then I remembered who I was. That evening, I received a voicemail from Margaret. Her voice was brittle. "I see now. You were never porcelain. You were steel beneath silk. I suppose that's why we feared you." I didn't save it, because I didn't need her acknowledgement. I had mine. The room was full. Brilliant women, sharp minds, polished shoes, clicking confidently against the marble floor of the Ember Point atrium. They came from cities I'd never stepped foot in, carrying stories I didn't need to hear to understand. I could see it in their posture, their eyes, the way they clutched their notebooks like shields. I stood at the podium under soft lights, no teleprompter, no script, just my voice, measured and quiet. Power, I told them, isn't given. It's not stolen. It's remembered. And sometimes we forget we had it in the first place. The applause was thunderous. Dozens of hands clapping for a woman they thought brave, fierce, victorious. Some stayed after for selfies. Others asked for mentoring. One even cried, clutching my hand, saying I'd saved her. I smiled, I nodded, I thanked them. But each cheer echoed strangely, like sound in a museum, too loud for such stillness, too full of praise for a soul that felt thinning. That night, after the crowd dispersed and the atrium lights dimmed, I walked through the quiet halls of the institute I had built. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected my image back at me. Tall and composed in heels, blazer sharp, hair pinned in the signature twist. There was no softness left in my reflection, only edge. I returned to the Prescott estate, not to reclaim, but to observe. The staff maintained the property impeccably under my management. Margaret, Daniel, and Catherine had moved out weeks earlier. Their absence filled the house more than their presence ever did. I walked barefoot through the corridor that once echoed with dinner clinks and faint disapproval. My fingers traced the wallpaper's edge. The chandelier above the foyer still glimmered like the day I arrived as a bride. In the guest bedroom, the one I'd used during the final weeks before they discarded me, I found the old vanity. The mirror was still there, slightly spotted, corners worn. I stared, not at the woman I'd become, but at the one I used to be. Rachel Whitmore. Bright, hopeful, willing to compromise for love, willing to shrink herself to make others comfortable. That Rachel had worn soft cardigans and spoke carefully to avoid overstepping. That Rachel had laughed politely at jokes made at her expense and thanked people for gifts wrapped in manipulation. She had been beautiful and vulnerable. She had believed kindness would protect her. Now, the woman in the mirror wore armor in the form of tailored fabric and strategic silence. Her power was undeniable, her reach expansive, her wealth substantial. But her warmth? I touched the mirror's surface, cool, smooth. I thought of Daniel, not with longing but curiosity. Could he ever have loved someone like this version of me? Or did he only love the softness I shed to survive? I turned off the light. My reflection vanished. Back in the master bedroom, I sat on the edge of a bed I didn't sleep in anymore, a space too large for one. I scrolled through messages on my phone, congratulations, media requests, invitations to galas, none from friends, none from family. I had burned no bridges, only walked away from them. Still, no one followed. Power has weight. It doesn't just elevate, it isolates. I wrote that down in a journal I'd started keeping again, not for planning, not for vengeance, just to remember. Because sometimes, in the roar of success, we forget the sound of our own hearts. I flipped back to the first page the day after I left Marigold Lane. My handwriting then was frantic. Now it was tight, controlled. Then I had written, "They think I am nothing." Now I wrote, "I have everything, except someone who looks at me without fear or calculation." I closed the book. From the window, I could see the new institute across the property line. Its lights shimmered like a lighthouse in the distance. I smiled faintly. It was enough, but I also knew I hadn't reached the end. Just a quieter chapter. The launch day of the Phoenix Institute began not with a ribbon cutting, but with a question. A woman in her 40s, dressed in faded jeans and carrying a battered leather folder, stepped into the atrium and looked at me. Not with awe, not with intimidation, but with raw, honest fatigue. "Do I have to know what I'm doing to start?" I smiled. "No, you just have to know what you're done tolerating." That's what the Phoenix Institute was for. Not a finishing school for elite professionals. Not a branding tool for me. But a sanctuary and a forge for women who had been dismissed, overlooked, silenced, or erased. Women who had been told they were lucky to be tolerated, who'd traded their ambition for survival, who'd learned to smile while breaking inside. The curriculum was built from everything I wished someone had taught me, not just how to manage wealth, but how to recognize invisible power, how to hold a room, how to own silence without fear, how to walk away from polished cages. The first cohort was small, 12 women ages 23 to 61. One had fled a high-profile marriage. Another had been blacklisted after whistleblowing. One had never worked a day outside her home but could map family finances like a forensic analyst. We didn't start with spreadsheets. We started with stories. I told mine, not the names, not the gossip, just the arc. How I was handed a dream gilded in control. How I accepted a cage because it had lace curtains. How I let my voice shrink until I forgot its shape. And how, when the locks changed, I didn't fall. I burned. And from that burn, I rewrote every line they gave me. Some cried, others just nodded like they'd known the story all along. We worked week after week in a space designed for forward movement. No portraits, no plaques, just glass walls, warm wood, and every door open. When Forbes requested a feature, I agreed, but on one condition: no profile shots, no interviews about my past. The headline read, "The Woman Who Built a Ladder and Then Threw It Down." I liked that, not because I saw myself as a savior, but because it meant others were climbing now. In month 3, we hosted a conference on financial autonomy, 200 women, 0 panels on work-life balance. Instead, we had strategy sessions on rebuilding after betrayal, on negotiating from a position you haven't been given yet, on the anatomy of leverage. I stood on stage and looked out at faces no one else had bet on, and I saw fire in every one of them. Later that night, I returned to the Prescott estate, but not as its sole occupant. I had spent months restructuring its legal framework. I didn't sell it. I transformed it. The estate was now a shared space, part historical site, part community hub, part retreat. The ballroom hosted roundtables. The garden became a cooperative project for local entrepreneurs. The library, once curated to impress old money, now housed a growing archive of financial wisdom by and for women. There were still echoes in the halls, but they no longer haunted me. Margaret had sent one final letter months ago, short, civil. No apology, but something close to respect. I didn't frame it. I filed it away like any document that no longer requires action. Daniel had written nothing. Catherine posted a think piece online about legacy and loss. I didn't read it. The house, stripped of its ghosts, breathed easier now, and so did I. I walked its corridors often, not to revisit pain, but to acknowledge it. Every staircase, every doorknob, every polished floor had once borne witness to my erasure. Now they carried purpose. On the 1-year anniversary of the Phoenix Protocol, what I privately called the day I began, there was no party, just sunrise. I stood at the edge of the garden, barefoot in morning dew, watching light bleed across the lawn. My reflection caught briefly in the glass of the back door, not sharp, not armored, just whole. No press, no eyes, no expectations, just me. I had nothing left to prove, not to them, not even to myself. The world called me a phoenix, but I wasn't born from fire. I walked through it, steady, and I never looked back to see if they were watching.